Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing well. We are joined today by Dr. Hanna Kassab, who's going to talk to us about understanding U.S. foreign policy from Bush to Trump. Dr. Kassab is a very prolific scholar. He's written more than 20 books. He's an associate professor of political science and security studies at East Carolina University. He received his PhD from the University of Miami, has graduate degrees also from Canada, and he's written extensively on foreign policy, international relations theory. He's always working on a book, very, very prolific. He's also written, dozens of journal articles and teaches on these issues of international politics and security. So if you haven't read his work, I highly encourage you to check it out. Thank you, Dr. Kassab, for joining us today. And the first question I wanted to ask is, at the end of the day, what is the long-term grand strategy of the United States? And are all presidents fundamentally realists?
For the first question, the long-term grand strategy of the United States is to remain a superpower or a hegemon. So it's the country or the state that defines the interactions, the the means of conducting business between states. So there's supposed to be certain rules. We've heard many presidents, many people talk about the rules-based international order. This is American hegemony. Now, the the common trait that unites Presidents Bush through Trump is this idea of maintaining hegemony, maintaining dominance, maintaining that rules-based order. The difference is that they go about it in a very different way. For instance, and we have to put this into context. In W. Bush's term, the first term, we saw a unilateral approach to foreign policy. You saw a president who wanted to pursue American interests independent of other actors, so to be unfettered by international organizations. We really saw a so-called America First strategy with President Bush. And we saw this in 2001 with the invasion of Afghanistan. He mentioned that you're either with us or against us, and this mentality, this frame of mind went into his invasion of Iraq, and then onward, going forward, we have President Obama, who operated in the same way, albeit from a very different angle. So Obama wanted to maintain consensus. He wanted to lead from behind. He wanted to ensure that his partners were involved in everything that he did. But there was also this emphasis on hard power. With Obama, there was more of a use of drone warfare, but also, with the Libyan intervention, there was this use of hard power, very similar to W. Bush. And then we go on to Trump, and Trump is basically I don't want to say classical realist, but he is truly the one who is looking out for American interests first and foremost. Hegemony is part of that, but the allies from Trump's perspective, the allies must follow. So he's not looking to gain consensus among equals like Obama did. He's not looking to pursue American power independent of anyone like Bush. He wants to ensure that his allies are doing whatever he says. So if their members of NATO want to increase their if the members of NATO should increase their military spending, that they're going to do it, or else there will be severe consequences for them, such as the threats of leaving NATO or not coming to their aid if Russia were to invade, Poland or the Baltic countries. And then we have Biden, and Biden is, I believe, he fits somewhere between Obama and Trump in the sense that he is like Trump, trying to pursue American interests in the region, but he's trying to do so um, through some sort of negotiation with allies. And I think that the first test was in 2021 with the withdrawal of Afghanistan. There was an enormous amount of pressure to do so. and he did it, and then that may have led to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine with this withdrawal from Afghanistan because of the pressure of the foreign sphere, that there was a vacuum, and that vacuum inherently may have led to, hypothetically speaking, we may never know exactly, but may have led to the invasion of Ukraine. And of course, the bait and the bleeding strategy, like the Biden administration is trying, what did try to bolster Ukrainian capabilities in order to bleed Russia white. And I think from that perspective, we saw Trump pull back from that, but also double down and do so very very strongly in Iran, and of course in Venezuela and in Cuba. These, and of course, and all of these are developing situations.
Yeah, the really interesting points we're going to jump into some of the tenets of each of the presidents. Again, we could speak for hours on this, but before we do that, just a quick comment. Then I was going to ask you a question related to the different forms of power. In reality, I think what you're saying is that there are continuities among presidents. There are major differences as well. But I think it's safe to say, too, that foreign policy is the area where the president has the most flexibility, right? A president can't pass a budget on their own, right? A president can't say magically the Congress must do this. But in foreign policy, you can change, and shift. But again, it's like driving a huge cruise liner. There's a lot of moving parts in the foreign policy establishment and apparatus. But I think when you look at kind of like the elements of foreign policy, that there's more wiggle room. And we'll get into that, the example of the case of Obama and Cuba. But before we go into the specifics, can you talk very briefly? You mentioned hard power. What is hard power? What's economic power? What's soft power? And then we're going to dive a little bit more into some of the tenets of each of the presidents.
Yeah, soft power is leadership, the ability to garner that support through just sheer charisma. The United States has a lot of soft power, and I think we saw this most clearly in the Obama administration, where states would be, inspired to follow a sort of Obama's perspective on what is clear and what was right. Although he did sacrifice a lot of his soft power when it came to the Libyan intervention, some of his failure in Syria, enforcing the red line, and not to mention the drone warfare in Syria. But this idea of being able to lead, that is a core element of soft power. Trump is I guess he's very difficult to get along with. However, one can clearly see that, especially in NATO, with the NATO chair, the head of NATO, being very closely associated with Trump. And so the idea of soft power is clearly this ability to lead. However, Trump has sacrificed some of his soft power leadership in favor of economic power and hard power. So when I say that, I mean that Trump has sacrificed some of his ability to lead the international system by coming down hard on countries who, from the American perspective, they're not holding their end of the deal when it comes to free trade, with tariffs, with cheating on the international sphere, dumping of steel, and just utilizing some of that force. And a lot of that, sometimes that has to do with the very institutions that the United States set up after World War II. Case in point, the WTO. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, is hamstrung because Trump and starting with Obama, but ending with Trump, Trump has refused to put in anyone from the American side in the regulation and judicial side of for the American representative at the WTO. So in many ways, there's a sacrifice of American leadership because the United States under Donald Trump prefers to pursue a very hardline approach to enhance the economic power, to create those opportunities for American manufacturing, and basically sacrificing some elements of globalization for to enhance American interests. And manufacturing is very important to economic power because it is the bedrock, it is the backbone of any country's ability to succeed militarily. In order to be a strong military power, you're going to need your own industrial base. The United States has lost much of that because of NAFTA and because of China joining the WTO, some of that. And so to enhance that position, it's very important to bring manufacturing back to the United States and therefore create that incentive to produce the goods that we need. And then there will be this, industrial capacity will therefore translate into military power. One of the major concerns for the United States right now is that we are lagging behind in shipbuilding, in submarines, in missiles. A lot of missiles were spent in the Iran war, and we need those, defenses. We need those military capabilities to be replenished. And so that's military power. And the way that it's used, and I think the best definition of power, I believe, is the Morgenthau definition. It's the ability of control, to control others. And so how do you control others? Through power. You can do so through consent, through soft power. You can do so through economic power, through the provision of tariffs and sanctions to ensure that your adversary does what you want them to do, or military power. When all else fails, then you have to do what you got to do.
Yeah, I think it brings up a good point. I mean, the United States is going to spend more than $1 trillion on its military, right? In the formerly Department of Defense, and Department of War, we spend more than the next 10 countries combined. We have 800 plus military bases around the globe. But I think one of the things we're going to look at now is kind of what you mentioned of the role of the United States in the world. What do we see in terms of great power politics, power projection? You mentioned the term leadership, also allies. So starting off with the Bush administration, George Bush 43, right? George W. Bush. His father was 41, as you all know. What was the Bush Doctrine? Scholars like John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, who've written books on this, talk about kind of liberalism on the march. And the goal of the United States was to really remake the Middle East. And they're quite critical of these strategies. Again, you mentioned this kind of go it alone approach, preventative wars. How do we understand the core tenets of the Bush Doctrine?
Hmm. The idea of Fukuyama plus force, I believe, is the best way to put it. Fukuyama had a great book in 1992 about the end of history, that democracy and capitalism would be the, end all of political systems, how we were to organize ourselves in the future. But in the Middle East, there are certain dictatorships that continue, and they're fascist. I mean, so some of these, the Saddam dictatorship, the Assad dictatorship, this relies on this, nationalism plus socialism, and it's a very hardline version of it, and that threatens our interests in the Middle East, primarily our allies in Saudi Arabia and in Israel. And so, Fukuyama plus force is the idea of overthrowing autocratic, socialist, authoritarian regimes, pseudo-fascist regimes, in order to enhance democracy in the Middle East. And the idea is that the more democracies, if democracy was to proliferate, then ultimately there would be peace that would follow. That's the essential idea of the liberal approach, democratic peace theory, which is inherently flawed when you think about it, because we have so many versions, so many tests that we put out there, and we have come to know that you cannot simply remove a dictator and somehow grow a democracy where there was never any experience, there were no institutions in those areas. The people are fundamentally unfamiliar. Sometimes the culture is not conducive to democratic ideals. And so when you think about it, that sort of approach was it's very utopia, it's very idealistic, and it's very dangerous. And W. Bush ascribed to some of those ideas, and I think it comes from the neoconservative ideology that was very prevalent in the 1980s and 60s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, And those very people who advocated those ideas found themselves in the administration of W. Bush. And so that's what we had after 9/11. It seemed that, hey, that seemed like a really let's do that. It seems like a good idea. Unfortunately, the power vacuum that was created in Iraq created Iran's supremacy, the so-called Shia crescent, that it seems to be unraveling as we speak.
There were, a lot of discussions of this kind of freedom on the march, of that the United States would be greeted as liberators, right? And I think one of the things that you mentioned is the kind of advisors, people like Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, right? The infamous battles between, Donald Rumsfeld versus Colin Powell, and Rumsfeld inevitably won out. And inevitably, when you're looking at the Bush administration, I think one of the criticisms were these kind of forever wars, right? Which we'll talk about, and the costs. Brown at the Watson Institute, excuse me, Brown University has estimated that trillions of dollars were spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, this question of how much safer are we today? So Obama was not in favor of the wars in Iraq. He wasn't yet a U.S. senator, but he came out against it as a junior, as a state senator. The Obama Doctrine, what was it, right? And some experts kind of contend that Obama focused, as you mentioned, a little bit more on soft power, on ending these quote unquote foreign wars, and also this element of working through institutions. And you use the term leading from behind. I think the case of Libya in Syria, Syria, he drew this red line. If Assad used chemical weapons, that would change his calculus, and Assad used chemical weapons, but ultimately decided against, getting involved in Syria. In the case of Libya, kind of working through the UN, working through the Arab League, but this giant question, particularly among the Republicans and the right in the United States, was Obama leading from behind, right? Was Obama, feckless in his decisions? And how can we kind of understand that? So how do you see Obama in terms of his approach to institutions, his approach to soft power, and his approach to U.S., power projection, particularly in the Middle East, which inevitably, he didn't pull out completely of Afghanistan and Iraq, right? I mean, he didn't pull out of Afghanistan as the Biden administration did. And then the critics would say that created this power vacuum and the Taliban took it over and seemingly, less than a week, right? Or in the expectation by a lot of the security analysts were, well, the U.S. spent billions in Afghanistan, but how long can the Afghan army hold the country? A couple months. So how do you assess the Obama Doctrine and versus the differences of the Bush administration and its foreign policy, particularly toward, let's say, the Middle East?
Well, foreign policy, the president is a central figure when it comes to the development of foreign policy, but you also have the bureaucracy that is also a major driver in foreign policy construction. So when we think about the Obama doctrine, we see a lot of use of force. We see through drone warfare. Um, in terms of the war in Libya, it was a primarily European problem. And so the Europeans were trying to handle it similar to Yugoslavia, the intervention in Yugoslavia in the 90s. The Europeans were handling it, but unfortunately, because of their lack of military capability, they don't have the power to achieve the goals, the stated goals. And so, in terms of in Libya, the Europeans were trying to handle it. They couldn't, and so they got Obama to try to assist with that. And when I say the bureaucracy, sometimes we think of it as a cabinet, but there's also the people under that try to make the orders of the president palatable or reasonable or feasible. And ultimately, in many ways, these ideas that started in the Bush administration find themselves in the Obama administration. And so there's a continuity between the two. And I think that's very clear because the very goal of Libya was the same goal in Iraq, and where I think Obama was genuinely trying to stay out, but for some reason he just couldn't. He couldn't, and he led from behind, meaning that the people who were less powerful, he maybe surrendered leadership to the Europeans, leading from behind, and let the Europeans kind of, I don't want to say the word sucker, but sucker the United States into Libya. Not trying to defend the regime in Libya. Obviously, Gaddafi is no friend of human rights. But ultimately, the tragedy of Libya is now that it is basically a power vacuum that is allowing for the free exchange of resources, weaponry, movement of different terrorist groups in northern and the Islamic parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So now it's a very dangerous world that we live in. And so, just to end with that, is the Obama administration, the similarities is it's possible that the similarities are tied to the bureaucracy that remains in force throughout the previous administration into his administration.